basic reason the Institute was founded was that objectivism is needed. So it's so desperately needed by America and more broadly by the world. And with the death of Ayn Rand, there was a real concern that the philosophy will disappear. Nobody will actually understand the philosophy and be advocating the philosophy and be applying it to today's world and the world that exists after Ayn Rand's death.
But if we were only to engage in generalities, wouldn't we then also be treating objectivism as a set of floating abstractions that's disconnected from the world?
Yeah, we're bearing her name. It's a real responsibility to take seriously that it's difficult, not impossible, but difficult to learn objectivism and then apply it. Did we go out of our way saying, well, we're not really speaking for Ayn Rand, as should be obvious, but looking at this event from the perspective of objectivism, these are the conclusions we've come to.
Donald Trump, immigration, abortion, Israel. The Ayn Rand Institute takes stands on these issues that surprise many conservatives and libertarians who otherwise think of themselves as fans of Ayn Rand. And we comment on these issues and we take the stances that we do because we think we are accurately applying Ayn Rand's principles. We do it in spite of criticism we sometimes get from her fans, even some of our donors. So one big question is, why do we do it? Well, that is a question that we are going to discuss today on the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Ben Baer, fellow at ARI. With me is senior fellow Onkar Ghate. Hi, Onkar.
Hi, Ben.
So, Onkar, you are a senior fellow. You're even the chief philosophy officer of the Institute, and I thought maybe you'd be the first person I want to talk to about this topic, especially given your context of knowledge about the history of the Institute and its mission. And what can you say to get us started talking about how ARI's mission fits into the question of why we comment on current events?
Yeah, so that's the right place to start. And I can quote a little bit from our mission statement or mission document, really, and anybody working at ARI will have seen this. And I'm also on the board of directors, and the board is charged with thinking about what the mission of the Institute is and then the execution of it. And here's a little bit, this is really, you can think of it like the Constitution as a preamble. This is the preamble to our mission statement. And it starts like this: the founders of this institute hold that historical trends are caused at root by philosophic ideas, that today's dominant trends towards dictatorship and destruction is caused by today's dominant ideas, irrationalism, altruism, collectivism, and that only a fundamental change in philosophy can avert disaster and bring about world freedom, peace, and prosperity. And then if you think of that as the preamble, then the mission is we're trying to change the culturally dominant ideas and the culturally dominant philosophy. And so the mission is, the goal of the Institute is to promote the spread of the objectivist philosophy by means of educational activities. So we're essentially an educational philosophic institute.
And you mentioned that everyone who works for ARI has access to this charter. And I remember when I came on board 7.5 years ago, that this was one of the first things I was asked to read as part of the onboarding process. And I noted that it gets more concrete than that, that it's not just that the charter says the way to change, the way to spread objectivist ideas is through education, but it enumerates the specific forms of education that we are to focus on. So, for example, it says training and or encouraging objectivist intellectuals, especially students in graduate school in the humanities and writers working on academic publications important to the advancement of objectivism. It's worth noting that our central focus, really, as an institute, is this kind of educational project, in particular by means of the ARU, program, which is heavily focused on training objectivist intellectuals. But it's not just that. There are other forms of education and other audiences of education. We're not just training intellectuals, we're also trying to teach something to the wider public about objectivism. And there's a note in this charter about how another form that education should take is disseminating objectivist ideas to the public at large, or to select professional groups by such means as wider dissemination of objectivist literature, use of the mass media, sponsoring appropriate periodicals, courses, debates, discussions, etc. And I mean, there are all kinds of ways we do this. There are all kinds of ways we try to spread Ayn Rand's ideas to the public at large. From the beginning, we've had essay contests, we've had conferences like OCon, Ayn Rand Con. We have podcasts. We're right here on YouTube today, trying to educate people more about Ayn Rand's ideas. And a lot of what we do is to try to educate people about Ayn Rand's timeless ideas, about the basic principles of her philosophy that apply regardless of time period. But that's not it. That's not all. And one thing that's especially interesting in the Charter, Onkar, is what it says about commentary on current events. And I'd especially like to hear you say more about this. But let me get it started just by quoting a relevant passage. So this is under the heading of restrictions on what the Institute is supposed to be involved with. So stands on current events. The Institute's mission is long-range and philosophical. Politics is an essential branch of objectivism, but it is understood that politics rests on the fundamentals of objectivism. It's metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Thus, these branches must be the focus of the Institute's time, activities, and budget. With this in mind, the Institute may take stands, support public statements, and engage in other activity related to current events if the stand taken is compatible with and helps promote objectivism.
Yes, and if you think of why this is in our charter, you have to go back and to the founding of the Institute in the 80s and remember part of the context that existed in the 80s. So I think the basic reason the Institute was founded was that objectivism is needed. So it's so desperately needed by America and more broadly by the world. And it's in danger of disappearing with the death of Ayn Rand, the originator of the philosophy, its leading intellectual. With her dying, there was a real concern that the philosophy will disappear. Not the books will disappear, but nobody will actually understand the philosophy and be advocating the philosophy and be applying it to today's world and the world that exists after Ayn Rand's death. But so that's one of the worries. But there was a real worry that any kind of institute like this will lose its philosophic bearing, in effect. And if you think in the context of libertarianism, and just in Ayn Rand's lifetime, in sort of the last decade of her life, it's, aren't you in support of the libertarians? Aren't these your allies? And she went increasingly out of her way. No, don't confuse my ideas, what I advocate, objectivism, with what the libertarian movement is pushing. With her death, and you founded an institute, there was a real worry it will move too much in a libertarian direction. And one way of thinking of what the libertarians were doing at the time, I think the best spin, it's unphilosophical. The worst element was it's anti-philosophical. It's, you don't need philosophy. You can get positive political change without changing the philosophical underpinnings of our culture and the ideas that are animating people and are framing the way they think about everything, including politics. So there was a concern, and the charter then addresses that yes, politics is vital. As you quoted, it's an essential branch of objectivism. You cannot detach it from metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And to take one example, I need to take an example here that you've spent a lot of time on while at the Institute, the issue of abortion. Now, you could treat that as just a political issue. What should the laws be? Why are people pushing this? But you can't understand the anti-abortion movement if you don't penetrate deep into its metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And if we're going to comment on a current issue, and I mean, it was front page when Roe v. Wade was overturned for months. If we're going to comment on it, we have to comment on it in a philosophic way, but it's not, oh, don't talk about it because politics is unimportant. Don't talk about it in an unphilosophic or anti-philosophic way.
Yeah, and I should say that the vast majority of the reason that I'm interested in that issue and want to comment on it is because I think it's so philosophically rich, because Ayn Rand's position on this issue is so distinctively objectivist in that it draws on every major principle of her philosophy in distinguishing her view from kind of the standard conservative view on the issue. And yeah, there is another movement where people often confuse Ayn Rand's ideas with another, and that's with conservative movements. So I don't think that was as much on the mind of the authors of the Charter, I imagine, but it's still another application of the same point. So it is important, though, that the language of that restriction about current events says that we should take stands on current events if it's compatible with and helps promote objectivism. And so here, Onkar, I think we should spend some time talking about why we think commenting on current events, at least in the way that we do, does help promote objectivism. And when I think about this, the first thing that always crosses my mind is, in Ayn Rand's own words, objectivism is a philosophy for living on Earth. And that means that she intended it to help guide our decisions for everyday life. And that includes everyday life outside of politics, but also we have to make decisions about the society that we live in. We have to make decisions about what we think about our leaders, or given who our leaders are, how to run our lives because of that. And so there's thinking about current events and thinking about politics is a central part of what it means to think about how to live on Earth. It's not the only part, but it's a pretty impactful part. And so when thinking about how we are going to go about educating people, I mean, obviously there's something to be said about how to educate the public, about how to think about the events of the day. We also, as I mentioned above, are super focused on training intellectuals, but I don't know how we can train intellectuals to use Ayn Rand's ideas in their writing unless we are training them to do it, training them to think about the world around them, training them to think about, and that includes training them to think about how to comment on current events. Obviously, not all of them are looking to do that professionally, but many of them are, and those of them who aren't, those of them who are, I guess, more academically inclined. I mean, part of the problem with academia today is that it's very ivory tower and doesn't think enough about how ideas apply to the world. And so we also want to encourage that even the academically inclined ones to think about that as well. And of course, it's not just about training intellectuals. Obviously, the public could stand to be educated about how to think about politics and contemporary culture by means of objectivism as well. And here, Onkar, one of the questions that we often get, I hear it coming from donors, I hear it coming from critics of the Institute, is why don't you all just teach Ayn Rand's principles, her abstract ideas? And that would still be educating people about her ideas, but then refrain from commenting on current events, especially since it can be so controversial and contentious, and objectivists disagree about politics. So why can't you just, in effect, speak in generalities and let everybody else do the application for themselves? And of course, people ultimately do have to do the thinking for themselves about how to apply principles and about whether they agree with anyone else's analysis of those principles or not. But at the same time, if we were only to engage in generalities, wouldn't we then also be treating objectivism in the same way that so many academics do when they make the mistake of being ivory tower about their treatment of ideas? And in effect, treating a set of ideas as a set of floating abstractions that's disconnected from the world. It's central to objectivism's view of philosophic ideas and of ideas generally, that abstract ideas derive from observed reality. They derive from the concrete facts and things that we observe in our daily lives. We abstract from those observations, and we abstract for the sake of applying these ideas back to new concretes. And so you need to know about the concept of selfishness in objectivism if you want to pursue your happiness, if you want to guide your own particular life in the specific situations that you encounter. You need to know about individual rights if you want to know how to interact with other people in society, if you want to know how to deal with your government. And so to say that we should, let's say, preach the doctrine and the concept of individual rights, but not show how it applies to thinking, say, about today's president, about whether or not he is a defender of individual rights, whether or not he is a violator of individual rights, that would just encourage this same kind of floating abstraction rationalism that we are so critical of contemporary academics for engaging in.
Yes, the criticism that, or the criticism / recommendation that we only focus on the principles of objectivism, but not their application, really means that you focus on the principles and not the concretes of reality. And that is, whether the person sort of pushing this line knows it or not, that's anti-objectivism. It's diametrically opposed to what objectivism is teaching one about the nature of philosophy and the nature of thinking. And this, I put it as its principles detached from concretes. Objectivism is an inductive philosophy, which means she's generalizing from observations in her own life, in her own culture, and across history. And there's so many elements in Ayn Rand's writing where, in effect, she's telling you, if you look at the history of Western civilization, if you look at the history of Western philosophy, this is what you'll see. You'll see these kinds of ideas being advocated for these kinds of reasons, having these kinds of effects. But she's telling you to go look, not take her word for it. You have to go look and study some of this. I mean, both you and I, we've studied the history of philosophy. We're both interested in historical periods and seeing the way in which the ideas, for good or bad, for good or evil, play out, and of thinking, is Ayn Rand's perspective on this right? Is objectivism right in regard? And she's encouraging you to go do that, not take her word for it. And nothing changes when it's not history, but the present, and looking at the concrete world. You have to think, do these principles, do they apply? Are they actually action guiding in a way that advances life? And in what way do they help you understand the world in which you live and have to navigate? And it's an ongoing issue. And any inductive science, and Ayn Rand viewed philosophy as a science and then as an inductive science. It's both. Here's a whole set of observations that are leading to these principles, and you are meant to use the principles to apply to the new concretes and to think, yeah, they are helping me integrate and understand the world, so I don't have to think all anew again of every new concrete I meet. I can use my principles to understand what is going on. And looked at from that light, I just find it bizarre that you could think we could talk about philosophy, but you can't talk about concrete events in the past or in the present. I mean, there's no way you could understand objectivism as an inductive philosophy if that's how you were approaching it.
Yes, and of course, to that end, I wanted to share this a passage from Ayn Rand herself, basically commenting on this issue, and it's we'll put it up on screen here. It's from her essay "What Can One Do," which was published in the Ayn Rand Letter in January 1972. And here's what she says: if you want to influence a country's intellectual trend, the first step is to bring order to your own ideas and integrate them into a consistent case to the best of your knowledge and ability. This does not mean memorizing and reciting slogans and principles, objectivist or otherwise. Knowledge necessarily includes the ability to apply abstract principles to concrete problems, to recognize principles in specific issues, to demonstrate them, and to advocate a consistent course of action. And skipping a little bit, if you like condensations, provided you bear in mind their full meaning, I will say when you ask what can one do, the answer is speak, provided you know what you are saying. And I take it part of what she means there in knowing what you are saying is knowing the meaning of the principle, knowing the meaning of the concept, knowing the kinds of observations that it comes from, so that there's some reason to think that you have good reason to apply them to the concrete situation you're looking at in the moment. Another thing I wanted to address here is she says this is something you should do if you want to influence a country's intellectual trend. And you mentioned earlier, Onkar, that the reason to be concerned with education about philosophic ideas is because it makes a difference in the world. That's the preamble that you quoted from that charter. And I also think it's really relevant that you can't persuade people to consider a new, radical, unconventional philosophy. You don't have any hope of changing their mind about it unless you are able to show them what these abstractions really mean, how they solve problems with the concretes in our lives today. And so just as an example, it occurs to me that it would be hopeless to try to advocate for and promote laissez-faire capitalism as a political system if you didn't do some serious work to distinguish capitalism from today's actual political system, which is a mixed economy, and yet one which many people frequently confuse with capitalism because, well, we're not communist, and there are businesses, and businesses are sometimes allowed to do things, sometimes allowed to make money, and our president is a former businessman and is sometimes thought of as an advocate of business and of capitalism. And if you didn't take some time to say, no, laissez-faire capitalism means complete separation of state and economy, and that includes even regulations and programs that are ostensibly offered in favor of business, you won't be doing the job. You won't be explaining the real meaning of what capitalism is. You'll leave it far too open to misinterpretation that what we endorse is today's system, when it's very far from that. Especially, Ayn Rand's, her book is Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So part of what we're trying to do is to make that ideal known by reference to the current system. What are the elements of capitalism? What are the elements that aren't?
And there's nothing distinctive here about Trump, other than, yeah, there's certain ways, because he's a businessman, and so it will be portrayed as, yeah, this is what capitalism looks like. But if you go back through just the history of the Institute, there was Reagan, and he was identified and wanted to be identified with he's the spokesman for free markets and capitalism. And you'll find a lot of critical commentary about Reagan from objectivists, starting with Ayn Rand, but certainly continuing after her death, because what he's advocating is not capitalism. And part of the reason it's important to understand that is when problems arise from what they're doing, the culture will typically say, well, this is what you get when you have capitalism. And it's important for people to understand, no, this is what you get when you have a mixed economy that's drifting toward statism. Or if you take Bush, the Bush Jr., the I've got to save capitalism from itself. So I've got to suspend capitalism to save it. And if you don't have some real understanding of, no, there's no such thing as suspending an economic system to save it, and what he's advocating is not capitalism, when you get a financial crisis like the 2008, 2009, when it's being blamed on private banks and so on, if you don't have a perspective, no, this is the product of so much government intervention in the economy, then one, you don't understand. So this is part of what Ayn Rand was saying. You don't understand your own principles or objectivist principles, and you can't apply it, and so can't show people it really does illuminate the world. Like if you have this perspective that Ayn Rand had on the mixed economy, it will be when you get crises like this, like the financial crisis, you have to think carefully about what are businessmen doing, so, and what is the whole economic legal environment in which they have to operate? What kind of government controls exist? And the financial system, and particularly banking, is one of the most controlled areas of the economy. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand it, and you can't show people what's actually happening. So why would they think you know anything? And maybe have, like, your philosophy gives you a perspective on the world that's illuminating, if you can't illuminate things like that.
And I think that what we've just said applies in spades to something like promoting the morality of rational self-interest, of the virtue of selfishness. That if you want to promote and educate people and change their mind about morality and convince them that, oh, there's actually a viable moral code here, you can't do it without distinguishing the objectivist concept of selfishness from the conventional view that a lot of people have, that they apply all over the place to our culture, to people that they claim are selfish. And the objectivist view is that they're not actually. So like the Bernie Madoff example comes to mind. Or here's another one. So back during COVID, I took a lot of flack for the things that I wrote about COVID. And yet the main thing that I was thinking about was the philosophic issue of what is selfishness, because here there were all kinds of allegations about how people who, for whatever reason, don't seem to care about how they're infecting other people and getting them sick, they're selfish people. And my point was, well, if there are things you can do to stop people from getting sick, to prevent the spread that you might yourself be responsible for, that would be the action of a selfish person who respected the rights of others. And that's another opportunity because many people on the left were accusing anyone who didn't care about how they were spreading the virus of being selfish. And that's just an invalid understanding of the concept, especially of something like the objectivist concept.
Can I take one more example as illustration of this idea that you cannot just speak about abstractions as though they're disconnected and unrelated to the present? And that's particularly true of philosophic abstraction. Take free speech as a third one. The idea that, so Ayn Rand was a champion of free speech as an integral part of the individual's rights. It's an aspect of his right to liberty. She wrote a number of articles about free speech issues, was some like recognized as free speech issues at her time, some not recognized as free speech, but she saw, such as antitrust and its connection to free speech. But the idea that you would just teach, well, about free speech and some past controversies about it, maybe, and what could you do? Could you only do the ones that Ayn Rand talked about and give only her examples? Can you give other examples? Other examples would be you looking at the world and thinking of how the principles apply. That's true of the past. And then in the present, it would be, yeah, like I've got nothing to say about the free speech and social media and so on. Yeah, I'm an advocate of free speech, but all I can do is talk about the past. A person will rightly, because you brought it up in the context of persuading, it will be rational for the person not to be persuaded. That's the crucial thing of saying, yeah, okay, and they may kind of dismiss it with, well, this may have worked in the past, but you have nothing to say that it's going to work today, and we've got all kinds of problems when we have to understand and do something. And if you're going to just say, well, yeah, I've got abstractions, but I have no idea how they apply, you look out of touch with reality because you are out of touch with reality. And the person is rationally not persuaded.
I've got one more passage from Ayn Rand I'd like to share on this very issue. And this time it comes from her book, The Art of Nonfiction, where she's giving advice to authors who want to very often comment on her ideas and how they apply to the world. And she writes, a corollary issue is that when your subject is controversial, you must take cognizance of any prevalent errors. This is not an issue of whether people agree with you or not, but of recognizing that if certain errors are widespread in a culture, your best readers may not know how your views apply to those issues. And so I read that, Onkar, as, well, this is a reason why you have to think about what the conventional views are. You have to write about them and distance your concepts from these conventional concepts. Now, I think that this recommendation that an institution like ARI only teaches the principles and doesn't bother applying them to contemporary controversies, if you ask me, it often really comes from the fact that the person just doesn't agree with the way that we're applying these ideas. And one form in which this comes out is the point that we're called the Ayn Rand Institute, but Ayn Rand is dead. No one can or should try to speak for her. And I think there's a point to that. There's a really important point to that. But we should clarify our thinking on it. I mean, obviously, nobody can speak for the dead, especially not for a genius who I think none of us can equal. And I would go even further than that, and I would say that the further you go in time from Ayn Rand's death, the harder it becomes even to talk about in meaningful form what she would have said about some particular event of the day. It becomes increasingly counterfactual. So are we supposed to think about what Ayn Rand in 1982 would say about if a Trump administration 43 years in the future, does she have some kind of magical clairvoyant power and that's how she's commenting on it? Or if she was still alive today and she was 120 and still somehow keeping up with the news, or are you supposed to think about what she would say if she's in heaven and has been watching the whole time? But obviously these are all fantastical possibilities and there's not really any way to answer any of them. The most that we can do, I think, and I don't think it counts as speaking for her very appropriately. It's simply trying to understand her principles, looking at the events of her day, and in her knowledge that she used to form those principles, and therefore trying to understand where they came from, but then trying to make judgments about how similar or different are the events of today to the ones that she was speaking on, in order to make the best educated judgment we can about how they actually apply. And insofar as it's the only sense in which it's speaking on her behalf, is that it's speaking in the spirit of the philosophy that she offered. It's a philosophy offered for living on Earth, and we're still trying to do that. And it's obviously a difficult thing to do, and it is a weighty responsibility. And we think very hard about, are we getting it right? And is this in the spirit of her principles? And I'm sure there are cases where we sometimes get it wrong. And I think we welcome correction when that's the case. But it's also true that I think sometimes people who differ over what she would have said also just don't know her philosophy that well and haven't studied it in the kind of detail that we have, and don't know as much about the context in which it arose and the kinds of concretes that generated it. And I mean, if I had a dime for every time somebody in a comment section on the internet said Ayn Rand would roll over in her grave if she heard what we were saying about abortion or about Ronald Reagan, I'd be very rich. And usually these people simply don't know the things that she wrote on these subjects.
Yes, that's definitely true for those two examples. Let me say a word about the fact that the Institute bears Ayn Rand's name. So you said that we take that seriously, and there's a real responsibility there. Part of what that means is we take seriously that she's the originator of a new radical philosophy. And to understand that philosophy takes a lot of work. So to go back, that we're interested in the training of new intellectuals, that means of objectivist intellectuals. That means of intellectuals who've understood and absorbed the philosophy, and absorbed it. By that I mean it's now it shapes their thinking, their new thinking. They're thinking about new events, current events, other subjects and issues that Ayn Rand never dealt with, but they're bringing the philosophy to bear. And that it's radical means it's the default is to slip into conventional thinking. So part of the training that we do is to really to really help people become sensitive to, yeah, but this is a radical philosophy, and if if you're developing a position that sounds, yeah, like a lot of people advocate that, the chances that being correct is pretty small. It's not. It's not like Ayn Rand disagrees with everybody on everything, but she disagrees with every philosophical fundamental. And to go back to metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, she has radically new things to say in all of them. And so that we bear her name, I mean, that's partly for marketing, but it's the identity of the Institute is to really try to um, to to educate for expertise in objectivism, and to embed at the Institute expertise in objectivism. And that's the sense, yeah, we're bearing her name. It's a real responsibility to take seriously that it's difficult, not impossible, but difficult to learn objectivism and then apply it. And so one of the bylines of the Institute was that we're experts in objectivism, and experts means something. It doesn't mean you get everything you say is right or true, but it means you spent a lot of time trying to really understand the philosophy. And the only time that we will comment on, like, what would Ayn Rand say, is when the media asks this a lot, of what do you think Ayn Rand would say about such and such and so and so. And again, going back to the history of the Institute, it's not like, oh, we just started doing media in the 2000s or something after 9/11. There, in the 90s, when I was still in school, there was an op-ed graduate school. The Institute had an op-ed program. They're trying to get articles in the newspapers, and so they were commenting on current events from fairly early on in the origin of the Institute. And there, it's the application to new things, but it was right to think, yeah, these people, they have some real expertise in objectivism. And these media, because the media's, they know Ayn Rand's name sells. So that's one of the reasons I think that they ask you, like, what do you think Ayn Rand would say to that? And those articles, when you started off with, well, we know nobody can speak for the dead. Yeah, normally those articles, that's what will say right at the start, because it's important to get media exposure. So if we think it's worth it, yeah, okay, we can do something about, like, but we go out of our way saying, well, we're not really speaking for Ayn Rand, as should be obvious, but we think we have knowledge of her philosophy, and looking at this event from the perspective of objectivism, these are the conclusions we've come to. And that's the application of the principles. But other than that, we never say that, oh, we're speaking for Ayn Rand.
So, Onkar, I thought we'd maybe close by giving our audience maybe just a bit of a preview for what they can expect from us in the near future, at least as far as commentary on current events goes. And I think the elephant in the room here, as it were, is that we're under a new administration in the United States, and this affects all of our lives in lots of ways, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I actually went and did some counting, and I looked at all the media we had produced in 2024, whether videos, podcasts, or articles, and I tried to put things in different boxes. Which were stories that were commenting on and critiquing some aspect of the left wing of politics, and which were commenting or critiquing on the right wing of politics, so to speak. And I discovered that at least in 2024, the final year of the Biden administration, the majority of our commentary was against the left. And I think it's not too surprising, given that there was a left of center administration in power. We had about 23 articles or videos critiquing left-wing causes or ideas or policies, not just the Biden administration, but the wider left-wing culture, whether it was campus and Palestinian protests on campuses or DEI or what have you, versus only about 17 on the right. And Onkar, I think that now that we have a new regime in power, in every branch of government, the Republicans and conservatives are in charge of the presidency, the Congress, Supreme Court. I think it's reasonable to expect we're going to have to say more about them than we have in the last year or so. They're the ones with power, and so they're the ones who are actually able to do anything. And so more of what there will be to talk about will be what is being done by conservatives, what's being done on the right. And I think that's especially in light of some of the things we said before about objectivism's idea of capitalism. We're radicals for capitalism in a way that's radically different from the way the right ever was about capitalism, and certainly today where they are increasingly abandoning the principles of individual rights and free markets. And so I think our readers and listeners can expect to hear more from us on this.
Yes, without a doubt. And that's particularly true because right now in the US, they control all three, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So they have significant control, and they're going to be the ones implementing their vision for the country. And it's not a pro-capitalism, pro-freedom, pro-individual rights vision. So if you're talking about current events and what's happening, yeah, it's going to skew in that direction. But I think it's important, we live in such a tribal age, to understand that current events are not what's the left doing, what's the right doing. And current events means the things actually happening in the world. And unfortunately, for most of the things, the major proposals about what to do, how to think about it, they're all wrong from whoever it's coming from. Whether it's coming from people who would now be put sort of on the right, or Jordan Peterson, philosophically, he's all wrong. If you ask his metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, it's all wrong in fundamentals. And so if those are issues coming up, yeah, you're going to be critical of that, but not critical as an end in itself of what proper principles would look like in regard to these issues. But if you take just thinking of two issues, foreign policy. So if you think of 9/11, the Institute spent a lot of time on 9/11. It's not as though you could classify that as we're critiquing the left or we're critiquing the right. We're critiquing both in different ways. They both in different ways were in denial about the role of Islam and the role of religion in animating our attackers and enemy. And the more from the right, the conservatives, Republicans, they love religion, so don't want to say a critical word about religion. More on the left, it's their sort of anti-civilization, so they respond to the Islamic totalitarians as, yeah, these are kind of barbarians, and that's part of what we sort of like about them, and certainly don't want to comment and criticize them and suggest as, some cultures are better than others and so on. And it was, as a result, our foreign policy was a complete disaster. But what we're talking about is our foreign policy, and it's a complete disaster, and that we need to respond properly to 9/11, and that nobody's doing it. And yes, when Bush was in power, you would talk more about foreign policy and what the Bush administration is doing. When Obama was in power, you talk more about what the Obama administration is doing. But the issue, what we're talking about, is foreign policy and how properly to think about it and all the ways in which it's not thought about. And the same is true of, say, Ukraine today. Biden was a complete disaster in regard to Ukraine. And when they were conducting or in charge of conducting American foreign policy, yeah, most of the time when you're criticizing the foreign policy, you're criticizing what the Biden administration is doing. And now it's the Trump administration. But the issue is like how to think about the conflict between freedom and dictatorship and what it means to be on the side of freedom. And that neither Biden nor Trump is on the side of freedom. That's not what we're doing is trying to figure out left versus right. So we're trying to understand the issues. COVID's another one like that. It's not like they're both parties were disasters in regard to COVID. And a real analysis of that is to understand that. And part of the power of objectivism is to get one out of tribal thinking. And any analysis of current events where you think, yeah, one of the current tribes, they're great, and the other one is bad, I don't think you really understand objectivism and the application of the principles, because this is part of what it means, that the trend is towards dictatorship and destruction. It's not like one tribe is leading us there and the other tribe isn't.
Very important to think about that. Onkar, let's wrap up, and I have just two resources that I want to share with our audience. One is that essay from Ayn Rand, What Can One Do?, which I quoted from earlier in our episode. This is reprinted in her book, Philosophy Who Needs It. Please check that out. There's a lot of implications there for not just what we do at the Institute, but what one can do in one's own thinking and one's own communication with other people to help push the culture in a better direction. And then secondly, there's another podcast that you and I did, Onkar, back in 2020. How can we change people's minds about Ayn Rand's controversial ideas? There's a lot of overlap between this episode and that one with regard to thinking about why we comment the way that we do, how it fits with our mission, how it fits with our charter. That one's more from the perspective of what we think it takes to change people's minds. And that was only a little bit of what we talked about today. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, comment, share, let us know what you think, help optimize that algorithm. And if you have questions you'd like to send us by email, send those to newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything that comes in and try to respond to what we can. So thanks for sitting down with me, Onkar, to talk about what I think is a really important issue, to give our audience more insight into what goes into the programming here at the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. And I hope it helps them understand more of what we say in the near future.